So this is LSAT Logic 101. And the deal with LSAT Logic is it uses words that we use and hear in everyday life, as well as a few words that are kind of unique. But what makes it difficult is they're using the words and definitions literally. So they're using, people often think there's like special LSAT words or special LSAT definitions for words in LSAT Logic. But everything has its regular dictionary definition. The difference on LSAT Logic is that it's very precise and literal in a way that we don't do in everyday life. So here's our topics. We're going to cover conditional statements, contrapositive, drawing and and or, and chaining conditional statements together, quantity words, negations, and combining quantity words and conditionals. So a conditional statement. This is where, like, you've heard the word condition before, but nobody says conditional statement in real life. So this sounds like it has to be something difficult. But the thing is, it's not so much difficult as it is different. So here's a conditional statement. All cats have tails. And why do we call it conditional? Because we really mean like on the condition that something is a cat, then it has a tail. So the sufficient condition is here, cats, and necessary is here, tails. And this word all is called an indicator. It indicates that cat is sufficient. So a conditional statement just has two things. It has a sufficient condition and a necessary condition. Now, what makes this different on the LSAT, the reason we can do logical diagrams, the reason this is called logic at all, is that they mean this literally. Because in real life, if you had a million cats, probably one of them's got a birth defect where they don't have a tail. And everyone would see that cat and say, oh yeah, that's a cat. I recognize that's a cat. Like, funny, it doesn't have a tail. That's a bit of an exception, but like everyone would be aware, yeah, it's still, like, it didn't become a dog or something because it is missing a tail. We all know what it is. But on the LSAT, when they say all, they mean all. They really mean it literally. They mean there are no exceptions, which means you can do math with it. You can make a diagram like that. C arrow T. So people will say things in real life. They'll be like, oh, like, people love chocolate, And that's generally true. But when you say something like people love chocolate, there's like a hidden indicator. Because, if I say cats have tails, that's the same thing as all cats have tails. So if I say people love chocolate, on the LSAT, I mean there's no exceptions. But it's easy to imagine that, in real life, if we say people love chocolate, we probably mean like 80% of people love chocolate, 10% are like whatever, and 10% hate it for some reason. So this is the difference between LSAT and real life, is that, and in law, too, we tend to take things literally, whereas in real life we speak figuratively and people understand what we mean. So you basically just have to put on a literal hat. You just interpret everything literally, kind of pedantic, and all this stuff will make a lot more sense. And it's important to note that conditional statements have multiple indicators. So all of these are the same sentence. They all mean C arrow T. They all mean every cat has a tail. So all and if are what's called a sufficient indicator. They indicate that what comes after it is a sufficient condition. Whereas only if indicates that what comes after it is the necessary condition. So same thing. It leads to C arrow T, but it's just the word that clues you in that this is a logical sentence. The only if, that's the one that's the indicator, and it's indicating necessary. It's also important to note that order doesn't matter. We want to go left to right when we're reading. So like this statement number 3 has the C in front of the T, so it matches what we're doing. Here though, in statement number 4, the order in English of the words is T, C. But because this, only if, is the indicator, then what comes after it is necessary. So tail is necessary and cat is sufficient. So it's very important to you look for these words and you see, okay, it is a logical sentence if you see these words, and it's the word itself, the indicator itself, that determines what's necessary and sufficient, not the order they're written in. And there'll be a list of these later in the presentation, a more thorough list. This is just for an example. So every cat has a tail, that's another indicator. It's also important to note that you can have negative forms. So if I say if you're president of the United States, you're not a senator. The not senator just becomes a negated S. You draw a line through it. So when you have a conditional statement, you can take the contrapositive. This is always true, but what is this? Contrapositive? Like, I'm sure you never heard this word before you started studying for the LSAT. I certainly never heard of this. You probably won't hear this word after you're done with the LSAT. So why is this here, and is this something difficult? The difficulty and rareness of a word does not tell you how difficult the thing itself is. This is a hard, weird word, but contrapositive is an easy idea, and if you just tell yourself that you can do it, it really is something you can do. So contrapositive just tells you what happens if the necessary condition isn't there. So like, if every cat has a tail, what happens if something doesn't have a tail? What can we conclude? What we can conclude is, since every cat needs a tail, if you're missing the tail, it's not a cat. That's it. So, you see this pen? This pen doesn't have a tail. So what can we conclude? This pen is not a cat. That's the contrapositive. It's just another way of saying the original sentence. That's all. Now you can write it in English. You could write, all cats have tails, or if you don't have a tail, you're not a cat, and we have this here as not T, error not C. So it is a different way of phrasing. But the point is, if you have a statement like this, you can always reverse the statement and negate it, and you get the contrapositive. It's just a shortcut. I see debates online like, do I need to learn the contrapositive? Like, oh, it's too complicated to do the contrapositive. But it's really just a thing that's true. And if you have a conditional, you swap the sides and negate it, and you have correctly done the contrapositive. Every conditional has it. You can always do it. So if I say, all P's are not Q, contrapositive is you reverse it. So this is step 1. You reverse it, and step 2, you negate it. When it's already got the negation, you negate it by taking away the line. So, see, I reversed their order, I've taken out the line. Just going to check for questions. Yes, someone in the chat says D only indicates sufficiency. I have that in the list later. It is a rare exception. Okay, so just reverse it and negate it. So if we have all bees make honey, B arrow H, reverse it, negate it. Simple as that. That's the contrapositive. I'm confident everybody listening to this can take a contrapositive once you can draw a conditional statement. Just do a bunch of these, and it'll become second nature. And the idea is eventually you can kind of look at something like this and be like, okay, well, if there's no H, I wouldn't have a B. Without even drawing it, just to look at the statement and know that that's how it works. Okay, chaining conditional statements. And another question that comes up with this is like, well, why bother diagramming this? If I see that every cat has a tail, it's obvious that it's C or OT. I can already understand that. What's the point of making a diagram? On the LSAT, they're throwing a whole lot of information at you. Like, just big paragraph of text that you've got to assimilate in a minute 24 and figure out the answer to what they're saying. So there's a lot of information. It's easy to lose track of it. And on certain questions where they've got multiple conditional indicators, that's telling you there's multiple conditional statements, and as a shorthand to remember what you've read. This is basically shorthand script to just tie some things together. So if I say everything with a tail, so here's the indicator, everything. Everything with a tail has a vertebrae. That's sufficient. That's necessary. T arrow V. We already had, if you're a cat, you have a tail, so we can chain it together. C arrow T arrow V. If we chain them together, this is simple stuff. We all understand cats and tails and vertebrae. But on a harder question, when it's dealing with something we don't understand well, but if you can look at the conditionals indicators and understand how to change stuff, you can make deductions about something that would be potentially harder to do if you were just trying to think about it. When I mean deduction, I mean something like, if you're a cat, then you have vertebra based on this diagram. You can go from the start to the end of the chain. So that's a deduction. And it doesn't matter how long the chain is, you can do this. Okay, so contrapositive, you can take a contrapositive of a chain too. So this is also where it gets useful. You just reverse the whole thing, and then you negate the whole thing. So C arrow T arrow V, reverse it to V arrow T arrow C, negate it to not V, not T to not C. So what this means in plain English is, if, again, take this pen has no vertebra, so what can you say? It doesn't have a tail, and it's not a cat. There's LSAT logic. It is more useful on the questions. Okay, there's other stuff you can diagram. You can diagram the word and or. So if I say anyone, there's our indicator, with a pet, has a cat or a dog, anyone with a pet has a cat or a dog, then what this means, and here's another thing, by the way. On the LSAT, you have to take the stuff they tell you as true. They'll often tell you that in the question. So we know in real life, you can have a pet that's not a cat or a dog. You can have a bunny rabbit. You can have a fish. But if you assume this statement is true, anyone with a pet has a cat or a dog, then what this tells you is if I have a pet, then I need to have at least one of these two things or both of them. So in the LSAT, the or is called inclusive, meaning could be one or the other or both. So you can have cat, you can have dog, you can have cat plus dog. Those are the three possibilities when you see an or like this. If it's an exclusive or, one or the other, it's actually something else called XOR. So if you could only have one or the other but not both, you would say if you have a pet, you have a cat, XOR a dog. Which, okay, this is another thing like contrapositive. It's weird. You've never heard it before. But it is occasionally useful, and it's not actually difficult. It's just rare. We'll cover that later. Okay, so you can draw that or statement, and you can change stuff together. So this will come up more on logic games, but if you say we have the statement, if you have a cat, then it has a tail and has vertebra, you can draw the statement like this. Pet, you have a cat or a dog, and if you're a cat, you have a tail, you have vertebra. So in this case, you can't actually say if you have a pet, you have something with a vertebrae. Now, I know in real life that dogs also have tails and vertebrae, but we can only conclude what we're given, right? So in this case, what we can say is, in the first case, either we have a cat and therefore a tail and a vertebra, or we have a dog, or both. I'm going to check the questions. Is that like those if not both rules? Exactly, yeah. That's what XOR is. If you say one or the other but not both, you can represent that as XOR. It's not necessarily useful to do that in most cases, but it's helpful to be aware of the concept, to know that there's a difference between the or and the exclusive or, that they're not the same. Okay, so this is more useful in logic games to separate something. And you can also take the contrapositive of something like this. So you reverse the whole thing. Actually, hold on. Yeah, better start here. With the contrapositive and or, you switch them. So and becomes or becomes and. So if you have a pet, you have a cat or a dog, you reverse it and swap the or to and. So if you have a cat and dog, you have a pet, but then negate it. So what this really means is, I'll just do it in one go. If you have a pet, you have a cat or a dog. So it doesn't matter how big these chains are, you can always take the contrapositive. So we switch the or to and we cross everything out. So if you don't have a cat and you don't have a dog, then by this logic, you don't have a pet. Okay. So I just want to take a quick pause. Does anyone have questions about what we've seen so far? Anyone want to see another example of one of the things that we've covered? Can I go back for a sec to the longer chain? Here's the full long chain with the vertebra, tail, cat, dog, pet. So since this is an and, like, if I show you this pen and I say, like, I've got something that doesn't have a vertebra and it doesn't have a tail and it's not a cat, you can't conclude that I don't have a pet, because I could have a dog somewhere else, and so we don't know that we don't have both of them. So for an and statement, you need both sides to conclude. Someone else, do we use that chain in LR? I've only seen it used for AR, logic games. I would say I've maybe used this on like 2 logical reasoning questions. Like, it is not common, but it is possible. And a lot of the LSAT, a lot of logical reasoning especially, is having stuff in your toolkit, so that if something comes up, you've seen it before, you know how to do it, and you can deal with it. But it's not a common skill at all. Even for diagramming in general, you probably only diagram about 1 to 3 questions per section. There's more questions on which understanding the logic of these conditional statements, knowing that all means literally all, is useful. But a lot of the stuff is not that common. The reason it's emphasized is that it's comparatively easy to learn. And if you can take something that's hard and make it easy, that's a big win, even if it's only a few questions per section, because that'll get you more points and make you go faster. Okay, so errors with conditional statements. There's three main ones. Two on this page that are basically the same error. So, logical flaws. All cats have tails. Here's our basic sentence. By the way, I like, you can pick any sentence you like, but I like having a basic sentence that you'll never get backwards and never mix up. Because we all know that like things have tails that aren't cats, like dogs have tails. We all know that cats do have tails. Whereas there's lots of things, like if I say if you're happy, you're healthy. You could easily, you know, it also makes sense to say if you're healthy, you're happy. There's a lot of things in real life that sort of go both ways. And so it's harder if you're dealing with something uncertain. It can be hard to know which way things go. Having this statement you can fall back on, that like you just always know how cats and tails work, is very powerful. That's one I like. I've heard other ones. Pick the one that is good for you. Okay, so what are the errors? Incorrect negation. That's where if you just negate it. So if I say that dog over there, it's not a cat, so it doesn't have a tail. And that's obviously wrong. But in less intuitive sentences, it might seem to make sense to incorrectly negate. And people do this in real life all the time. Matter of fact, one of the ways of convincing people that something is wrong is making a bad argument for it. So, you know, if you say like, if my argument is right, we should leave. And someone will say like, well, your argument's not right, so we're not leaving, right? Like this is the very worst thing you can do if you're trying to convince someone, is have someone make a bad argument for your position. Then they're just going to forever think that your position is wrong. So, but that's an incorrect negation. Just because someone makes a bad argument for something doesn't mean that the thing is wrong. So this is like such a common error in everyday life. Incorrect reversal is like thinking that if you see the necessary condition, you must have the sufficient. So, I see a tail over there, so there must be a cat. But the tail could be from a dog, a monkey, anything else. So they're really the same error. Because if you take the contrapositives of these, you end up with the same, you know, the contrapositive of this is that. It's, no, what am I saying? Sorry. The contrapositive of the second one is that, which is the same as the first one. So they're really the same error. They're really each doing half of a contrapositive. Okay, here's the other one. This is much of a less common error, but taking the diagrams literally. So the diagrams are just a shortcut. They're a shortcut to represent the ideas in the stimulus or wherever else, but the actual truth of the matter is the written English. So here's an example that leads to a flaw. So if I say anyone who is a parent has a child, P arrow C. Any child is really young, C arrow Y. So seems like we can combine them, right? P arrow C arrow Y. Conclusion: parents are young? No. Or parents are really young? No. Like that's not how it works. The proper conclusion here, if we follow the English, is anyone who is a parent has something, a child, that is young. So it's very easy to mislead yourself with diagrams in a few cases if there's just like a switch in words like this. And this is not a common mistake on questions, but I have seen a handful of questions where this happens. The other thing too, you know, really young, I like having fewer letters. You could say like if you're a child, you're really young, but I find Y is simpler. But, you know, here you can see I've switched parents are young. If I was following English, it would be parents are really young, or if you have a parent, you have something that is really young. So diagrams are just a shortcut, but you do need to be aware of what the English said and not, like, especially if you're on a tricky question where you're having trouble, check back the English and check that they didn't have some distinction between the diagram and your English. I've seen people spend like minutes puzzling over answers when it's actually just whatever they diagrammed isn't representing reality. I've also seen people do like, you know, like they'll say P, R, X, arrow, Y, L, Z. This is, you know, I don't know what this would represent, but like this gets confusing if you diagram this. You want one letter, two letters max to represent ideas, because once again, the truth is in the English. The diagrams are just a shorthand. If you have three letters or more, it's not good shorthand. You're practically writing words. Also, if it helps, in some cases, you can write out a whole word. could write that out. Or you could write P arrow have child. It's not, there's no rigid format here. We write single letters by convention, but you're free to break the rules when it makes sense. Okay, so list of indicators. Let me just go back to my list here. It was hard to format this on the spreadsheet. So here's some common indicators: all, each, every, any, and by the way, synonyms too, like, anyone, everyone, those are also sufficient. If, that's a big one. And then, I said there's other ones. This is just an example. If I could say, in order to be a cat, you must have a tail. There's a necessary indicator, by the way. Must. The only, someone mentioned that. Why is this sufficient? Because if I say, like, the only way to be elected president is to win the most votes. Well, actually, see, that there's one you could easily get backwards. The only way to go to law school is to take the LSAT. So, law school, LSAT. Now, it would be backwards if you say if you take the LSAT, you go to law school. Like, lots of people take the LSAT, even get the score they want, and decide, you know what, I don't want to do law school. You're not, like, magically thrown into law school, no option to leave as soon as you take the LSAT. The proper order is if you take the LSAT, if you go to law school, you must have taken the LSAT. So when I say the only way to get to law school is to take the LSAT, the only indicates sufficient. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you want another example. Okay. Necessary words are only if, and so remember, as an indicator, this means what comes after them is necessary. So if I say, if you are a cat, you must have a tail, must have a tail, must indicates that have a tail is necessary. Anything that talks about need or needs shows necessity. Requires, unless, but this one has an asterisk, so we're going to look at it. Essential. This is one, it is essential that you have a tail if you are a cat. I don't even know if I can think of an LSAT question to use this, but the point is it's like the kind of thing that they can use. So you're going to see other words that indicate sufficient and necessary. This is just examples of the most common ones. You should definitely know everything on this list. But you also need to be able to recognize new ones and understand them. So we're going to do an exercise on the next slide on translating conditional statements. Let me just check the chat. Someone said with some of the LR questions, we need to take the contrapositives and answer choice. I keep finding answer choice. Could you clarify? I'm not sure what you mean. Okay, so translating conditional statements. You want to replace the hard phrase with an easy one. Let me just check my next slide. So here I say, like, a particle is not a hadron unless it contains quarks. Quark, I don't know. And take a moment, write down how you think this should be drawn. Because it's obvious there's going to be an H and a Q in there, but what's their order and are they negative or not negative? Okay, that's enough time. I basically just want your gut instinct. So something is, what you want to do is, when you see a sentence, and this is more for review than in real time, but once you practice doing this, you can use this in real time too. And this is how I actually learned these statements myself, by the way. I started as an LSAT teacher. I was on like phone support. People would just ask me questions and they'd say like, what's this word mean? And I'd be like, I don't know. Let me think about it. And I would take it and make the sentence simpler. So, a particle, something, is not a hadron unless it contains quarks. Something is not a blank unless it's blank. Something is not a cat unless it has a tail. Now, that's, I think, if I were to ask you how do you put cat and tail into this sentence, I think you could generally come up with this. Most people can come up with like how to put cat and tail into a sentence in a way that makes sense. And you know how cat and tail works. So what this means is this is the negation of the sufficient, and this is the necessary. So the way you draw this is hadron, then it contains quarks. H arrow Q. So Does that make sense? You take out the nouns, you replace them with cat and tail, and then you translate the sentence that way and figure out what they mean. So if anyone has an example of like a conditional statement that really stumped them, I would love to see that, because we can write it down, do the same exercise, and work out how it goes. Let's see. Okay, I'll look at that question after. So here's just it written out again. Replace a hard phrase with an easy one. Something is not a cat. So here's our indicator. Something, not a cat. So this is the negated form of sufficient, and this is the necessary. So unless it indicates the necessary, but then the thing before it, you negate it and make that the sufficient. So say I say like, if you leave, you need a key. I don't know. So like if you leave, you need a key. What that means is if you, hold on. No, sorry. Let me just check if that is still sharing. No. All right. Okay. I think after this, I'm going to go and just try and figure out how I'm causing it. So let's say I said, just trying to think of an example that's positive at the start. So like if you, okay, so let's say you're in the tournament you're in the tournament unless you're eliminated. So how that works, you're in the tournament unless you're eliminated. So that one is like if you're not in the tournament, you were eliminated. So if something is in tournament unless it's eliminated, we negate the sufficient, so it becomes not T, and then after the unless is the necessary, so that's E. Did that make sense? This is just like to say that whether you have a not or don't have a not, whatever it is, before the unless, you have to negate it. After the unless, it's necessary. Before the unless, it's negated form of the sufficient. So usually they have a not, like, you're not happy unless you're healthy. That means if you're happy, you're healthy. But it is possible to make a sentence like you're in the tournament unless you're eliminated, or you're in the tournament until you're eliminated, which is kind of similar to unless. Until is a similar word. You negate the sufficient. Okay, see, someone's got an example of a sentence that they think is difficult. Which sentence do you find difficult here? Oh, unless the polls are grossly inaccurate, Slater will win. Unless it's necessary, with the difference is you negate the thing in front of it. So here, unless polls are wrong, Slater wins. So remember I said it's the order of the indicator words rather than the order of the words. So like Slater wins unless polls wrong. So if Slater doesn't win, the polls were wrong. So after the unless is necessary, before the unless, Slater wins, you negate it. Did that make sense? It didn't make sense. Okay. So this is our indicator. This is necessary. This is sufficient, but you negate it. So Slater wins. You put a not there and say if Slater does not win, then the polls were wrong. So let's take another example. Let's say I say, I'm going outside unless it rains. So we know that what's after the unless is necessary, unless it rains. That much is clear. It's the I'm going outside that's confusing, right? So let's think about this. If I go outside, do I have magic powers that make rain occur? I don't think so. And you know what it means, like I'm going outside unless it rains. If it's not raining, what am I doing? I'm going outside. If it does rain, then... Well, no, sorry. It's not if it does rain. It's that if something keeps me from going outside, if I didn't go outside, it's because it rains. I'm going out under all conditions unless it's raining. So if you see me and I'm not outside, then you can infer it must be raining outside. Making sense now? And by the way, so I would venture to say that the word unless is practically the only thing that's difficult for this diagramming. It's at least like it is substantially harder than the rest of conditional diagrams. So I would just do what I just did. Make a statement like, I'm going outside unless it rains. Make 10 statements like that and just try drawing them. Reason your way through them. Think about, does it make sense to say if I go outside it starts raining? No, that's illogical. So take some statements that make sense in real life, try drawing them, really wrestle with them, and what you want to do is get an intuition for it. Because I see people dealing with unless, and they're just like, they're trying to remember this like after the unless it's negated, and after the unless it's necessary, before it's negated, and you put a not and something. And that's just it's not an intuitive way to understand English. The only point of the rule is to like training wheels to get you to try some examples so that you can do them, and then it just makes sense because you already have a reasonable understanding of the word unless in common contexts. What you want to do is strengthen that using the rule, using practice, so that you can understand the word unless intuitively, even with a subject matter you don't know. The rules, the indicators are just training wheels. Yeah, someone's got a good thing, like with unless, until, without, except. Say, if I'm not going outside, then it's raining. So I'm going outside unless it's raining is the same thing as if it's not raining, or if I'm not going outside, then it is raining. You can convert unless into if not. I still think eventually you want to use this to go even further so that you just understand unless without even needing to use a trick. But that trick should be foolproof and work on 100% of times. So I endorse it. I think it's a good method. Okay. Next thing is quantity words. So we're leaving behind the subject of conditionals until we have a bit of diagramming with quantity words. So any questions about conditional statements in general, or diagrams, or and or, any of that stuff before we move on? And let me just see if I can write down this if not unless. So like, if I am not out, it is raining. This is the same as I am out unless it is raining. So here's the indicator. Here's the indicator. This is negation of sufficient, whereas here, this is a sufficient. So you see how basically what this does is it moves the not. Right now the not is in this underline here. We say this whole thing is the negated sufficient. The if not phrase makes this the sufficient, and you put the not into the phrase itself. Hopefully that helped. Yeah, and they say formal logic is Greek to them, which I completely understand. You probably saw me struggling with the unless there at a second. But I would say to learn this stuff, collect every single question that gave you trouble with a conditional statement and just repeat it the same way you would with a logic game. Keep drawing it over and over and play around with it, and it does get easier. It's just like no one's born doing this stuff. We all, if we know it, it's because we learned it at some point, and I believe it is learnable. That's the thing I would leave you with. Okay, if you have any more questions about conditionals, leave them in the chat. I'm going to move on to quantity words. So, quantity words. These are the 4 main quantity words on the LSAT. None, some, most, all. There are others. We're going to cover them. But the big thing I want you to think about these words is to think about them like a range. And the full extent of the range is from 0 to 100. I really mean 0 to 100%. But let's just talk about numbers. If you had like maximum 100, 0 to 100, then what are these in numerical terms in terms of the range? Because in real life, if I come into a room and I say like, hey guys, I got some food, you all have some idea what I mean by that. Like, if there's 10 people in the room and I say I've got some food, then I've probably got like at minimum snacks for 10 people, and at maximum like meals for 10 to 15 people. And as in, at a party you often have more food than you need. But if I had like 3 grains of rice, or if I had like a transport truck full of beef and I brought it into the room, like, in either case, you'd all say like, why did you say that? Like, it was very misleading, right? Like that. Why did you say some food if you meant you had like a speck of food, or you meant you had like a truckload of food, right? So in real life, when we say some, we generally have some idea in mind. But on the LSAT, it's actually a precise range, and you should use that full range. So here's the example I like to give. Let's say there's like a barrel of apples. So I did not... art was not my forte. Here's a barrel full of badly drawn apples. And let's say I'm going up to this barrel of apples, and I've got one. There's my apple. And I've just tried it. And you ask me, hey Graham, are those apples in the barrel any good? And the apple that I tried was good, so I say to you, at least some of them are, because this one is. So just that one apple is enough to say at least some of them are. I think most people would accept that as a correct use of the word some in the English language. You've also probably heard, let's say you've got a brother or sister, and we're talking about where to go for dinner. And let's say you don't like, Mexican food. And your brother or sister says, like, to your mom or dad, well, like, there's this great New Mexican restaurant in town, but I know some people wouldn't like that. We all know they're referring to you, to one person. One person is what the word some refers to. So even though in real life, most of the time, we don't mean one when we say some, technically, there are cases when it does mean one. And because the LSAT is technical, then the full range for the word some is 1. And then what's the maximum range? 1 to 100. Why 100? Let's go back to the apple barrel. So I tried an apple, it's good. What about the rest of them? Well, like, none of the apples have to be bad. In fact, we'd hope if the apple orchard was making good barrels of apples, they don't put rotten apples in the barrel. So every single one of the apples could be good. So when I say some, it's anywhere from 1 to all. If part of your mind is still like resisting this and saying, but this can't be true, just play around with some examples, but accept it as true for right now, because that's just, well, it's how it is in the LSAT. It's what the words mean. And if you come up with some other examples, it can make sense, but that's what they mean. None is simpler. It's 0. All is 100. Most is anything over half, so in this case, 51 to 100. But if we were dealing with a larger number, it'd be like 50.1, 50, anything slightly over half. So these are, for the most important quantity words, these are the ranges. And so it's important to take these literally. So in real life, if I say like, let's say you're a general leading troops into battle, and I'm like the ruler of a nearby state, and I say, I brought you some troops to help out. in real life, if there was actually some kind of war going on, you would assume I had like a reasonable quantity of troops. If I brought one soldier, you wouldn't be very happy with me. And if I brought like 3 million soldiers, you'd be surprised that I had that many, right? Like, you would be expecting some more constrained range. But on the LSAT, when you say I brought a soldier, or I brought some soldiers, I've read some books, it's literally anything. If I say I've read some books, it could be a single book, or it could be I've read every book in the world and I'm some kind of AI cyborg sort of thing, right? So you've got to think, in real life we're used to thinking of a specific point within a range. On the LSAT, you got to think of the whole range. So here's our ranges. Then we have negations. Negation is something you hear, especially for necessary assumption questions. What it really means is just like not none, not some. Like, what's the opposite, the logical opposite of these? And the answer is it's everything that's in the range that's not here. So like none is 1 to 100. That's the negation of none. It's in, if you have no airplanes, you negate that to say you have some airplanes. So 1 to 100. If someone says they have some airplanes and I say, no, you don't, then that means you have 0. If I say I won most of the votes in the election, no, you didn't, means you won anywhere from 0 to exactly 50%. 0 to half of the votes. And if I say I've got, like, I won all the votes, you say you won not all of the votes, which is 0 to 99, so you could still have a resounding election victory. And this is like, I remember when I was first doing LSAT training, like to be a teacher, this was something that all the LSAT teachers had trouble with. We were trying to do negations and trying to remember these formulas, and the head teacher got frustrated and he said, like, just disagree with me. Because, you know, if I said to you, like, the New York Yankees are going to win every game this year, you wouldn't turn to me and say New York Yankees are going to win no games this year. Like, that's just not plausible. You would just say, like, they're going to lose at least one. They're going to win not all of their games. So the negation of all is not all, which means 0 to 99. And in most cases, you want to negate, like, from 100 to 99 and see if that makes a difference. So if you're negating most, assume you have 51, negate it to half or less. Some is none, the negation, and none negates to some. Any questions about this? How do we combine the quantifiers? I'm going to cover that a few slides later. Okay, so here's our quantity words, their ranges, the negated range, and the word, the English word that expresses this range. So this is a good one to screenshot. This is something you definitely want to basically have this memorized the way you would memorize like a times table. And if you never memorize the times table, this is a good place to start with memorizing, because this is just very useful to, oh, for God's sakes. 0 to 50. Alright, let's go back to this correct table. Screenshot this one that actually has the right numbers. I have to have a word with my PowerPoint staff, in other words, me, because I made this PowerPoint. Yeah, but you want these memorized. You want these intuitive, such that you could hear like some, and you know what its opposite is. You know that the opposite is none without like just thinking about it. You want it to be automatic knowledge. Okay. So here's some other common quantity words. And I see endless debate about this, like on Reddit and elsewhere, because some companies teach that the LSAT is using special definitions. So they'll say that like a few, several, many, that they all just mean some. That they mean 1 to 100. And this doesn't make any sense. There is no way in regular English that if someone says like, I have a few pets, that they mean they have 1,000 pets, right? Like, that's not even technically correct. That's just wrong. Now, why are some companies able to teach this is that, like, in practice, the LSAT actually I've never seen a question that tests the distinction between a few and some, but it is possible, and I have seen some that have the distinction between some and many. So, like, they're not the same. On a strengthening, we'll get to strengthening questions later, but there are some questions where many is different than some, or where some equivalent. So they're not the same, but in practice they kind of are. Oh my goodness, there's no, here we go. So the real answer is these words have their dictionary definition. So like a few is like 3 to 5, or a small amount. Like, by the way, I highly recommend using a dictionary when you're studying for the LSAT. Any word you're not sure of the precise meaning of, just look it up. If you're on a Mac, it has a dictionary app. It's got the Oxford Dictionary built in. It's very practical. And it's good to just get the precise definition. So like a few is a small amount. Few is a small percentage. So if I say like he got few votes, I mean he maybe got 2% of the votes, which in America would be, you know, a very large number, but not that big for what matters. Several, like, I don't know, 4 to 9, it's basically also like a small amount, just a bit bigger than a few. And I feel confident saying that no LSAT question would test a distinction between a few and several, and they're just approximate. We speak loosely when we say these in English, and they're context dependent. Like, I tend to think of many as kind of like 20 to 100, but it sort of depends on the situation. And when I say 20 to 100, I mean like percent. You know, if I say he got many votes, then that would be many millions of votes in America. But as a percentage, it would be 20 to 100%. So where this matters on a strengthening question, for example, you have to take the words at the weakest end of their range. So if I say, like, if I want to say that some person's popular and I say they have some friends, that means like one friend, that's not very persuasive. If I say they have many friends or a large amount of friends, then it sets a higher minimum. So what's really going on with many is it's got a higher minimum. And if I say someone has many friends, that does strengthen the idea that they're popular. So I'm not sure I've actually seen the word many used like that, but like a large amount, which is a synonym for many, is something I've seen on strengthening questions. Almost all, again, I've never seen this tested technically, but it's probably like 90 to 99. I looked up almost, and it says not quite in the dictionary, so I don't think this could mean all. Whereas the vast majority might be like 80% to 100%. And this is the only one from this list you really need to know. All of these words, the LSAT uses them like most. It's the one case where, like, I'm not actually sure that these definitely mean most in real life, but the LSAT treats them as such. And so these all are like 51 to 100. And any other word that is like these words, it also means most. So we're going to get to drawing most statements pretty soon. These ones, you can convert them into a most statement. And in practice, you know, when we're drawing a sum statement, you can take a few, turn it into a sum statement, and it works. Just know that, like, the map is not the territory. Like I said, there's a difference between the diagram and the English. The English is what decides it. So I always will make some statements out of these, but I just know that many is different than some, and if a question ever came down to it, you need to know what the English actually said. Okay, good question. Someone asked about, just for negating, just put the word not in front of it. So they asked about how do we negate not, or how do we negate hot? It's like not hot. Yep, that's pretty much it, which doesn't necessarily mean cold. You know, on a perfectly pleasant day, if it's not hot, that doesn't mean it's cold. It could just be, you know, a nice temperature. So this is the difference between, like, a logical opposite and a polar opposite. You have, like, cold. Now how? So you have, like, cold, neutral, hot. And not hot is like anywhere from cold to neutral, whereas not cold is anywhere from neutral to hot. So that's how you negate. You put the not and think about what that means in common sense. Okay, so someone asked about context dependent with respect to quantity words. How about the term a significant number? That would be like a few versus a few. A significant number seems like many to me, but it kind of depends. Like let's say I said like a significant number of voters voted for this candidate. That seems like many. If I say like a significant number of the patient's organ systems are failing, that could be like 2, right? Like you really don't want 2 of your organs failing. I'd say it probably has to be more than 1, even though in reality, if any organ system is failing, that's very bad. But so there's a significant number of nuclear reactors are in meltdown. That's also probably 2 because you don't want any to be in meltdown. But if I say a significant number of people are in this class, then that's going to be at least like a reasonable chunk of the discord is here. Okay, so hopefully this chart is correct if you want to screenshot this one. But I want to emphasize, like, you don't really need to know these numerically. The only thing is just, like, use some common sense for what the word means in reality, and that's what it means. And on practice and most questions, if you're mapping it to a statement you're drawing, you can draw a some or most statement, but just you got to be aware that, like, if the question ever actually tested it, that many and some are not the same. It's not common, but it can happen. Okay, so the key points about quantity words. They're ranges. In real life, we think of a very specific number. In practice and the LSAT, it could be like anything within the range is possible. Can I spell? Literally. Interpret ranges literally. So if I say sum is the big one here that you want to interpret as like 1 in a lot of cases. On strength and weaken questions, you want to interpret sum as 1. Almost all can't be all. I would not stake my career on almost all not being all, because I've never seen a question test this, but I don't think it could be. Right, and you will see sometimes some, but not all. I have seen that. That would be like 1 to 99. That does come up on some questions. Here's a good one that comes up on logical reasoning and reading comprehension. When they say, like, which of the following would the author agree with? If it's something like, all schools help their students, or no tiger makes a good pet. The thing about categorical statements like that is they're almost never true. I am sure somewhere there's a really bad school that actually makes its students worse. I know some people have tigers and apparently they're good pets. I wouldn't keep one, but like the point is that like in real life there are always exceptions. So you're asking what would an author, a reasonable author, because the LSAT authors are reasonable, what would a reasonable author agree with? They wouldn't agree with an all statement. No reasonable person would agree with an all statement. That's which is a funny thing because we say them all the time, but we don't mean them literally. But on the LSAT, they do mean them literally. So I don't want to say it's always wrong, but just think, if I interpret this statement literally, would people agree with it? And if the answer is no, then it's probably not what the author would agree with. Obviously, if the passage shows them saying they agree with that literally, then that's the right answer. But it's just a hint that maybe they didn't actually say this. Because if it's some crazy belief, if interpreted literally, they probably didn't think it. Hopefully that makes sense. As like a lot of LSAT advice, you got to remember, you hear these things like, oh, my teacher said blah, blah, blah. It's like, it's a tendency. It's like it works 99 times out of 100, but you have to use common sense when interpreting it, and there's a lot of nuance here. Okay, so on negation, negate to the upper end of the range, e.g. negate all to 99%, negate most to this. So on a necessary assumption question, most is not a strong answer, because most of the time, if I say like, if I'm trying to say that someone's popular and I say most people like them versus not most people like them, if half the people you meet like you, you're still popular. We really don't. The only reason we would usually care about going from 51 to 50% is if you're in an election and you need like a literal majority. Other situations, you're usually happy with either. Likewise, going from all to almost all generally doesn't matter. Again, context dependent. If all your organ systems are working, good. If almost all of them working, not good. But in most cases, if it's like, if all of your meals are tasty versus not all of your meals are tasty, we can tolerate a single non-tasty meal. Yes. The most answer choices are generally wrong because it goes from 51% to 50. Again, just a tendency, but generally that's the case. Okay, diagramming quantity words. So, let's say I say some cats are black. The first thing about these is that they're reversible. So I can say some black things are cats, some cats are black. And if I say most cats are black, how I'd actually draw it, I would draw it like this. You just couldn't really write that in PowerPoint. Cats, most of them are black. And again, if they say this on the LSAT, take it as true, even though I don't think this is true. And people often ask, are most statements reversible? They reverse to a some statement. If most cats are black, then some black things are cats, but it doesn't mean most black things are cats because there's a lot of black stuff in the world. But at least since the cats exist, then we can say some. So why would we draw this? Because you can combine them. So if I say some cats are black and I have all cats have tails, you just reverse it to the order where it connects with the sufficient, and you can say some black things are cats, all black things are tails. So you can say some black things have tails. Which black things? Cats. So this is a kind of deduction you can make, and there are questions, especially must-be-true questions, that'll test this deduction. It's important to note that you can't go backwards. So if I say like some things with tails are dogs, you cannot do this. You can't say some dogs are cats. It's only on the left-hand side. It's only on the sufficient side that you can do this. Yeah, here's another example. So if I got all cats are tails and I have most cats are black, you can't combine a most statement here. Whereas if I said, like most pets are cats, then I could say pet, most cat, and then therefore most pets have tails. Also, if you do see a most statement like this, because it reverses to black some cat, you can say some black things have tails. You just can't say most black things have tails. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I get this question a lot. Can you take the contrapositive of a quantity word? No. There is no contrapositive for C sum B. It's not even a concept that matches what a quantity statement is. Contrapositive only works with an all statement. It only works with conditional statements. It's something mathematically true there. You cannot do it for some statements or most statements. You can reverse them, but that's not a contrapositive. So you can negate them. I can say it is not true. I've never drawn a none statement, but this would be like the negation. But that's not the contrapositive. So no contrapositive is a whole other concept. Let's see. Okay. So you can combine two most statements. You can't combine two some statements. You can't combine a sum and a most statement. And the reason this doesn't work is, let's say I say like some black things are cats and some black things are walls. This just doesn't work, right? Like, there's no reason this needs to overlap, and a wall is not a cat. So this just doesn't work. Now, the reason you could be fooled is, you could say like some Americans are named Biden. Some Americans are president. Oh, yeah, some presidents are named Biden. Cool. But like the fact that what I just said is true, it's not logically true because of two sum statements. It's just a coincidence. With two sum statements, what we're looking for when we're combining statements is something that logically forces something else to happen, and you just can't do that. But you can with two most statements. So if you have the same left-hand side on a most statement, most Americans wear hats, most Americans drive a car, you can say some people who wear hats drive a car. Who? Americans. And the reason this works, the example I like to give it, let's say I work 3 days of the week. And you work 3 days of the week. Let's try and make ourselves not work on the same shift. Let's just do a work week. So I work the first 3 days. I'm trying to like stay away from your shifts. So most out of 5 days, most is 3 days. If we each work most of the days, we always have an overlap on Wednesday, on at least one day. So that's just a simple example. But even if you're talking about millions of people, like millions of Americans, if you're talking about most, two sets of most, it's still going to have that overlap. We're not going to count out 300 some million Americans to prove this, but it works the same way as it works with this tiny number. So this is the only time you can combine two most or some statements. So what can you combine? All plus all, yes. Most plus all, yes. Some plus all, yes. Most and most, yes. Some and most, or some and some, no. And it's important to know, when I say this, I don't mean you can combine any two all statements. They have to actually match. You know, if I say all cats have tails and all dogs have tails, I mean, okay, I guess you can combine that and say if you're a cat or a dog, you have a tail. But if I say all cats have tails and all dogs have bones, you can't combine this. Just because it's two all statements, they have to actually connect on a letter. But if the proper letters connect, you can combine these first several statements, but not the bottom two. Any questions so far? Okay. Now we're just kind of typing didn't work there. We're just kind of cleaning up like a few other concepts. Hypothetical statements versus real statements. So if I say, if you're a unicorn, you have a horn. Okay? We can draw that as, if you are a unicorn, you have a horn. Does this mean unicorns exist because I've said this phrase? No, it doesn't. Whereas if I say all cats have tails, first, I think just the very fact of saying all implies that they exist. But to make it even stronger, if I say I have a cat, then that means there really is a cat in reality. I have it. And we can represent this as like a circle. And what that means we can conclude is I have something that has a tail. So this is just a useful way of representing like a specific fact versus a hypothetical conditional. Because like, you know, in some horrible future, maybe all the cats go extinct, right? And so it's still true that cats have tails, but it no longer means that there are cats in the world. But if I say I have a cat, then that means cats exist, and you can apply it to the statement above. So, and I have seen LSAT questions kind of make a distinction between, are we talking about a conditional versus are we talking about a fact? So it's important to have this split. Okay, Zor, talked about Zor. It's like if you pick, if you have a meal, you can have a dessert or a salad, but not both. That means you have a dessert, Zor, you have a salad. Again, I'm not sure you would necessarily want to draw this way, but it's just helpful to distinguish between the case where you can have one or the other, but not both. How's the contrapositive? Here, it would be if you have a salad and a dessert. Actually, or you have no salad and no dessert, then you didn't have a meal. See, the fact that I had to struggle to think of that means you probably will never, ever, ever have to draw this. But I introduce it just as a concept, and it's important to know that XOR is not OR. So why does this work? It's like, well, you need to have one or the other, but not both. So if you have both or you have neither, then you didn't meet the requirement. So this is technically how you do the contrapositive, but again, I've never seen a question that, well, maybe I saw one question, but it's not common. Okay, looking at the chat. Okay, just general chat. Glad you guys are talking. And okay, so summing up. When do you diagram? Which question types? So I got a list here. And it's not that you would diagram any of these questions, but if you're not on one of these question types, then you probably shouldn't be diagramming. So, must be true. Sufficient. Parallel. Flaw. Parallel. Principle. Flaw. Logic games, clearly. And increasingly I've seen like reading comprehension becoming more logical reasoning like. I'm not sure I've actually drawn something on reading comprehension, but I wouldn't put it past them to eventually have a reading comprehension question that requires conditional diagramming. Okay, so must be true. Also important to say not most strongly supported. This is a common mix-up. On a most strongly supported, the answer is only like 80% true. So there can be some wiggle room. People sometimes say like, but why is this the answer? Couldn't there be? I'm like, yeah, there could be that exception, but it's just saying most strongly supported. Whereas must be true, it's saying it has to be 100% true. And it's that 100% that means you can do conditional diagrams. Sufficient assumption, generally speaking, these are, no, yeah, they're making it 100% true. So that's where the diagramming comes in. Again, not every sufficient assumption question is something you should diagram, but a lot of them are. And you should practice diagramming them so that you can recognize when to do it or not. Parallel and flaw parallel often have conditional arguments that you have to match. Principle, I would say principle application, principle justify. Those are maybe principle parallel. Those are the main ones you draw. Flawed reasoning, you generally wouldn't draw it, but what they'll do is they'll sometimes have incorrect reversals or incorrect negations in the flaw questions. And in logic games, obviously you're going to draw them. So in logical reasoning, it's probably 1 to 3 questions per section. And if it's not one of these types, like I see people try and draw a necessary assumption, I don't think I've ever really done that and found it useful. I'm not saying there's no question outside of this type where you would draw it, but it's not common. So it's helpful to know where to draw, because then I see people try and draw questions that aren't drawable, and obviously that's going to slow you down and confuse you, because if it can't be done, then trying to do what's impossible is not going to be productive. And to reiterate, the point of diagramming is to take stuff and take it out of your head. So on these questions, when do you diagram? It's usually if there's like 2 to 3 conditional statements or a conditional statement and a quantity statement where it can save space in your head to draw them and take them out of your head. That's when I would diagram from another presentation. Okay, so that is everything.